Welcome to what is thankfully the bonus episode of You're All Doomed, the podcast that has forced itself to talk about Jason Goes to Hell, the final Friday, 13 minutes at a time. I'm Greg.
I'm Brian.
And we've now covered this movie in great detail. What are your main thoughts, Brian?
I really only have two issues with this movie, if I'm being honest. The first one is the images on the screen, and the second one is all the words that are spoken by the characters. But other than that, I really can't say I have much of an issue with this movie. I mean, I'm just going to be honest. It's a fucking mess. And I know we've mentioned this in other episodes. We're not taking shots at the filmmakers. They had their reasons. I don't agree with most of their reasons, but that doesn't mean that they've done something wrong. I know they were trying to do something different, and I can appreciate that. You know, there had been 8 Friday the 13th movies before this. Please go ahead and try something different. I'm all for it, but it's got to make sense, and it's got to track with what else we've seen in the other movies. If you want to start incorporating new parts to the story, that's fine, but it has to make sense. And none of the stuff that they introduced makes any sense. And it ends up being this kind of standalone movie that feels absolutely nothing like a Friday the 13th movie. Even during the beginning, during the FBI raid, which is pretty cool, but if you stop to think about it, it really doesn't make a lot of sense. It's cool. It doesn't feel like a Friday the 13th movie, but at least there's like elements of it where it's like, okay, it looks like we're at a camp. There's this damsel in distress. So we've got little bits and pieces of it. And then they just completely abandon it at like the 15-minute mark, and they just never recover. And it's just, this movie was just a slog. I remember when you and I came up with the idea for the podcast, maybe 5 seconds after we came up with the idea, we both kind of looked at each other and we're like, you know, we're going to have to do this for Jason Goes to Hell, right? And it was a stopping point for us. We're like, yeah, we don't know, like, what are we going to say about this movie? And like, we don't want to be, you know, spiteful and just, you know, rip it apart, because that's not fair. But, you know, I think we did a pretty good job of pointing out the things that we liked, and, you know, anything that we didn't like, we discussed why we didn't like it. But it was just a disaster. And I remember just being excited to see it the first time, and then just the train going off the rails almost immediately, and it just never recovered.
I couldn't agree more. Anything I say will basically be repeating what you just said, but I'll do it anyway. I've tried very hard this season to refrain from being insulting to the filmmakers. And if I've slipped in that at all, I apologize, because I do think that they're all well-intentioned, creative people. And, you know, it's a difficult thing to put something of this magnitude together and put it out into the world, and you don't know what kind of reaction it's going to get. So, you know, I'd be happy to say anything any criticism I have, I would be happy to say to their face in a polite way. I'd be happy to have a discussion with any of them about this movie. You know, I don't think that they set out to insult the fans or anything like that. I just think that they made a lot of misguided decisions. You know, I understand the rationale that Adam Marcus had making this movie, which was, there are 8 previous movies of a killer running around, you know, a campground, or Manhattan. So if you want to watch a traditional Friday the 13th movie, you have plenty of opportunity to do so. He wanted to do something different, and like you, I applaud that in theory. But the key element is that what you come up with has to both not contradict anything that came before, and hence damage the previous movies, and B, it has to be cool even if it were something completely separate from the franchise. If this were its own horror movie, would it still have been good? And I think the answer is no. It's got elements of other movie series that it tries to glom together in a debatably successful way. Never once is it scary. We've praised the gore effects and certain things here and there, but it's not even a very successful movie, even if it were not at all tied to the Friday the 13th series. So its failures are compounded by the fact that it is tied to the Friday the 13th series, and in fact ignores or flat out contradicts things that we had been told previously about the characters. So, I mean, I have a lot of problems with the movie. I stand behind those opinions, and if you're listening to this and you do enjoy this movie, that's fine. I don't think you're wrong. It's all opinion, but I do think that you and I, Brian, have done a good job of backing up our opinions with reasons. There's some debate between them about whether or not Sean Cunningham dictated to Adam Marcus that they had to get rid of the hockey mask. The hockey mask is an element that Sean Cunningham was not involved with in the least. It came to being in part 3, by which point he had long since departed the series. And in fact, Jason as the killer was not the story Sean Cunningham intended to tell. The whole pulling Alice into the lake at the end of part 1 thing was not meant by Sean Cunningham to be a real event in the universe that happened. So he declined to participate in part 2 because Jason was going to be the killer based on the producer's instructions. So I kind of have always felt, unsubstantiated because I've never met the man, but I've kind of always felt that Sean Cunningham slightly resents Jason being the face of this franchise. Sort of the same way that I suspect George Lucas grew to feel about Darth Vader kind of taking over, becoming the most famous character in that franchise. And so he then had to rejigger his overall story to make Darth Vader more important, instead of just being like the heavy. And I would say the same thing about Thomas Harris, maybe resenting the fact that Hannibal Lecter became such an important part of Silence of the Lambs. So when he wrote Hannibal, the novel, he sort of, I feel like he went about it with the approach of, oh, here's some crazy shit. Let's see you film this. You've made Hannibal Lecter this like anti-cult hero. Let's, we'll have him eat someone's brain and then sleep with Clarice Starling. Like, it's sort of like they kind of, their creation outgrew what they originally envisioned, and they then kind of resent that, which would be fair. I mean, I wouldn't blame him if that's the case. And again, this is all speculation and mind reading on my part, but it's backed up by some things Adam Marcus said. To be fair, Sean Cunningham flat out denies that. He says he understands that the marketing push behind the hockey mask makes total sense, and he never would say, get the hockey mask out of there. But the bottom line is the hockey mask is not in this movie a whole lot. So I think there's some basis in fact.
Yeah, I mean, really what this ends up being is like a body swapping movie that just is bookended with a couple of Jason scenes. And it's one or the other. You can't do both. This movie proves that you can't do both. It's just a mess. And, when this, I mean, just to give you not to hammer home the point even more, but, when the Friday the 13th series came out on DVD for the first time, it was the Crystal Lake to Manhattan set, which was the first 8 movies. And I bought that as soon as it came out and loved it. And, I don't remember when that came out, at least 10 years ago, maybe even more than that. And
2004.
2004. Okay. So 16 years ago, as of this recording. And up until maybe 4 months ago, I never owned Jason Goes to Hell on DVD. I owned every other movie in the franchise, sometimes double dipped and bought it on Blu-ray, but never owned Jason Goes to Hell because I just never saw it as something that was part of the franchise and not something that I ever really wanted to watch. And the only time that I have watched it is when you and I have been doing something like a marathon where we watch all the Friday the 13th movies, or we're doing a podcast, but it's absolutely never going to be a movie that I want to revisit as part of the series. I'd be happy to just skip over it.
I mean, I'm in the same boat with you. Every time I watch it, I think this is the last time I'm ever going to watch this movie, and then somehow I keep getting pulled back into watching it.
But I will say that every time I watch it, I hope that I see something that I haven't seen before. And like it starts to grow on me. You know, like I'm not a huge fan of the movie Blade Runner. The first time I saw it was probably back in like middle school, and I was like, this is boring. I don't like it. Watched it again in high school, and I'm like, all right, maybe it's not as boring as I thought it was. College, you know, after college, and I continue to watch it like, you know, maybe once every 5 years or something. And I admit it's growing on me. It's becoming something where I'm like, okay, I get it. You know, I can see the appeal. It's not as boring as I thought. I can appreciate some of the finer details. And I do quietly hope that, you know, every time I watch Jason Goes to Hell, even though it's not that often, that something's going to click and be like, you know what? It's not that bad. But I mean, we joked about that heart eating scene, but I mean, that really is the moment where it's like, okay, that just doesn't resonate any differently than it did the first time I saw it. So nothing's going to change. This is the exact same movie I thought it was.
And I think for me, the reason I react so strongly to this movie, or at least did at the time, is that the franchise had gone a bit fallow for a couple of years. You know, Paramount had abandoned the franchise after Jason Takes Manhattan in 1989. So we'd had a pretty long stretch of a Friday the 13th movie coming out every year or so, and then it went quiet. So this movie came out in 93 under a new studio banner, and the potential was there to kind of reinvigorate things. And I'm not sure that was the right time to try something new. I think they could have maybe gone back to basics and done something a little more traditional. You never want to give fans what they want or what they expect, but I think they maybe should have hewn a little bit closer to the formula before trying something crazy and new.
Yeah, and I know the reboot concept is relatively new to Hollywood, maybe within the last 10 years, but you're right. I feel like the New Line acquisition was probably the best opportunity to reboot the franchise. Like, okay, yeah, there's been 8 of them. They've been, done by Paramount. They've kind of been run into the ground. There's not really any more new ideas left. Just start over. Establish, give us enough things that we like about Friday the 13th, but then introduce some new things that make it your own, and then you can continue down that path with whatever direction you decided in. But this, there's no way they anticipated this to continue on into some sort of, sequel. I mean, obviously there's the Freddy Krueger thing at the end, but that's not a sequel. That's just another idea for a movie. So why introduce all this body swapping nonsense and enchanted dagger if there really is no intention to do anything with it again?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. The reboot thing was probably a little bit daring for that day and age, but they ignore any continuity between part 8 and 9. This was the first movie that just completely disregarded Jason's fate from the previous movie, which I don't blame them for, because he was a little boy laying in a sewer tunnel. So
yeah, figure out your way out of that one.
Right. And yet then they have some continuity with other elements of the previous entries of the series. So they kind of tried to have it both ways. And I think that a clean break would have made more sense. And if they'd wanted to introduce some of these, chosen one prophecy bullshit things, they could have done that in little pieces here and there with a reboot, and then had a full-blown culmination of that plot line later. I think they just tried to do too much of that in one big jump, and that was, in my case, not successful at all. I mean, seeing this together that summer was pretty important for us. It was the summer of '93. I think you were about to head off to college. I had just finished my freshman year.
Yeah, based on the release date, I think I might have like days before I went away for my freshman year in college.
I think so. We were both working at a grocery store that summer. We've mentioned this before, but we spent the 2 weeks leading up to the release of this in August watching all of the previous movies, which was sort of the first time we did a marathon viewing, watching all of them. And we were excited. I mean, we were definitely into this movie, and we went opening day, and I remember we both had, shitty clown alley hockey masks, and plastic machetes that we were going to wave around every time Jason killed somebody.
It's hard to believe that those machetes stayed holstered for almost the entire movie.
Yeah, I think we gave up pretty quickly. My memories of the screening are a little bit foggy, but I feel like it was early afternoon, and it wasn't empty, but it was by no means busy. And I remember, we were on board fully for the first 7 minutes or so. And then things went downhill pretty quickly once the heart-eating episode took place.
My memory is definitely foggy too, but I know how I felt during the heart-eating scene. I knew I was in trouble. I have kind of like a vague memory of people in the theater chuckling when that happened. Like an uncomfortable, like, hey, not this is hilarious, but oh shit, what have we gotten ourselves into? And then the rest of the movie, yeah, it's very much a blur. I think I was just kind of mostly stunned silence, and then, maybe reinvigorated a little bit when I saw Freddy's glove come out of the ground. But yeah, I mean, we were excited, and it's, there at that point we had not seen many of the Friday the 13th movies in the theater. And so it was a big deal. And this was obviously way before the internet, social media and everything. So we didn't have a lot of opportunities to see any trailers. Who knows if we had even seen a trailer prior to, going to the movie. We just knew we were going to go. So there wasn't really a lot to be concerned about. So we went into it with high hopes, and then all of our hopes and dreams were crushed on an autopsy table.
I think we had seen trailers for it on Entertainment Television. Because, yeah, I mean, you're right. The internet was in its infancy at that stage. And I had, at least in my case, I had not paid any attention to Fangoria magazine or anything because I was focused on my freshman year of college. And so it kind of came out of nowhere. But we were juiced. We were definitely excited.
From a trivia standpoint, thanks to Jason Takes Manhattan going over budget and becoming the lowest grossing Friday the 13th film ever, Paramount said farewell to the franchise. The actual film rights belong to Boston-based theater owner Phil Scuderi and his partners, and Sean Cunningham saw this as an opportunity to jump back into the franchise. It was Cunningham who ended up spearheading the discussions with New Line, who controlled the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, paving the way to make a Freddy vs. Jason movie. But there was a couple of problems with that idea. They had no story for this proposed movie, and Wes Craven was already planning to direct a new Nightmare on Elm Street movie. Greg, you had mentioned that Adam Marcus grew up being friends with Sean Cunningham's son, Noel, and so this was the connection that Sean Cunningham needed to essentially give the directorial gig to the 23-year-old Marcus, almost as a favor. Oddly enough, John McTiernan was asked to direct, but he opted to direct Last Action Hero instead.
Huh. I wonder which would have been better.
So once they abandoned the idea of the Freddy vs. Jason movie, the original idea would be to ignore Jason Takes Manhattan and pick up where The New Blood left off. The film would open with a mysterious man dredging Jason's body back up to be autopsied. But instead of rising from the dead during the autopsy, which was being performed in a nearby cabin that was converted into a science lab, Jason would wake up as his own black heart was being removed from his chest. This would somehow instantly render the mysterious man powerless, who would then eat Jason's heart and absorb his powers. The big reveal would be the identity of the man, Elias Voorhees, Jason's unmentioned brother, or father, depending which source you read. But it's not clear where the story would have gone from there, which, oddly enough, is kind of what happens with Jason Goes to Hell. The original title of the movie was Friday the 13th, Part 9, The Dark Heart of Jason Voorhees.
Ugh.
But the reason why this film eventually got titled Jason Goes to Hell, The Final Friday, instead of Part 9, is that New Line didn't have the rights to the name Friday the 13th.
Yeah, I mean, I love that there's, even back then, layers of all of this rights issue problem that we're seeing now with Victor Miller's lawsuit, which is, complicating anyone from releasing any new content that's related to Jason.
Another idea for the movie that was being floated around that I can't decide is better or worse than what we actually got was Jason Takes Los Angeles, where he would start murdering rival gang members, and this would force the rival gangs to band together to take on Jason Voorhees.
I feel like that would result in a scene where we get Jason surfing on a giant wave, much like Snake Plissken.
Yeah, and it also kind of sounds like Predator 2, kind of pitting two drug gangs against each other. But yeah, I mean, that's what I don't understand. I mean, I think it's harder to make movies these days than it was back in the early 90s. So there was, probably a little bit more policing of ideas. But the fact that this was ever even floated as an idea, like, hey, what if it was in L.A., and there were these two gangs and they were fighting each other, but then they had to, band together and be friends so they can kill Jason. And obviously it didn't go anywhere, but the fact that it even was approached as an idea is just mind boggling.
What if Jason was killing people in a department store, and one of the mannequins came to life because she was secretly an Egyptian princess, and she and Andrew McCarthy teamed up to fight Jason? We could call it Jason 2 on the Move.
Jason Takes Mannequin.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah. Apparently there were some attempts to have Betsy Palmer make a cameo in the movie, but she rightfully declined.
Good call, Betsy.
Jay Hewley's final draft of the script was apparently so bad that Sean Cunningham recruited Dean Lorey to come in and fix it in just 4 days. So you have some explanation about, why we ended up with the movie that we did, but at the same time, we don't know how much was fixed in those 4 days and how much is this from the original script.
As we mentioned, this movie came out on August 13th, 1993. It made $7.6 million that weekend, but was number 2 behind the second weekend of the Harrison Ford action classic, The Fugitive. It then dropped off quickly, only managing a cumulative gross of $15.9 million, which was still enough to make it the highest-grossing horror film of the year, unless you count Jurassic Park as a monster movie, because that was the number 1 movie of the year and a huge hit, regardless of your criteria.
Jason Goes to Hell wasn't a complete disaster at the box office. It did manage to beat out Harvey Keitel's Penis and the Piano. Also, the criminally underrated Tony Scott Quentin Tarantino film True Romance. It beat out RoboCop 3. Talk about a franchise that dropped off hard after that original movie. It also beat Dazed and Confused, Robert Rodriguez's debut El Mariachi, and one of my all-time favorite movies, Airborne, which introduced Cincinnati's infamous Devil's Backbone to the world.
Some other notable movies that came out in 1993. Fire in the Sky, which we saw in the theater and love, has a really great alien abduction scene. Weekend at Bernie's 2, starring Bad News Cruz from this series. And Army of Darkness, the third movie in the Evil Dead series that KNB also did the effects for. This was also the year that we lost actors Brandon Lee and River Phoenix. So it was kind of a heavy year.
Some of the taglines that attempted to entice people to see this movie in the theater were, "The creator of the first Friday returns to bring you the last. Evil has finally found a home. Jason goes to hell, and he's not coming back. Horror has many faces. Death wears many different masks, but pure evil wears only one, and this is your final chance to see it."
I have to wonder, when they add the word final to these movies, do they honestly believe it at the time? Or do they figure like, well, we'll just, we're probably going to make another one at some point. But it's they've done it twice now, and it's hilarious.
Well, especially since this was the first one that New Line was doing. So, like, what makes you think that New Line would acquire this franchise simply to do one movie and then bow out?
Fantastic point, especially because it ends on a stinger that makes us want to see the next thing. So,
yep.
That's hilarious. I do remember that I liked the poster and the commercial with that kind of shiny metal hockey mask. I didn't think it was going to be in the movie, but I thought that it was kind of a badass way to embrace the iconic hockey mask look.
Well, I don't know about you, Greg, but I am more than ready to leave hell and get ready to venture into the great beyond.
Gladly, Brian. Gladly. Thanks for sticking with us this season. If you would, take a moment and rate and review us wherever you listen to podcasts. But come on back, because next season we're going to talk about Jason X.
So until next time, go to hell, Greg.
Go to hell, Brian.